Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, June 8th New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And we'll start with this bit of news. Trump wants to call the shots, but in Iran, he keeps hitting his limits. And this is by Anton Troyanovsky. President Trump has defined his career in politics with displays of dominance and control, but in the Middle East, he faces a rolling crisis that keeps thwarting those impulses. On Sunday, Trump lashed out at Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, telling the Financial Times that the Israeli leader won't have any choice but to accept the U.S. negotiated deal with Iran. I call all the shots, he said. But early Monday, Trump was still trying to rein in Netanyahu, writing on social media just after 5:30 a.m., Israel and Iran must immediately stop shooting. 100 days after starting the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran on February 28th, Trump is grappling with his own version of the sort of Middle East military quagmire that beset his predecessors and that he promised to avoid. On Sunday, Trump tried to deny that he had ever made such a pledge, telling NBC News that I don't like these endless wars, but also that this is not an endless war. He won a tactical reprieve on Monday when Iran and Israel both said they would hold their fire after their first strikes on each other since April. But the fundamental deadlock remains as Iran hawks in Washington warn that the president faces a strategic defeat and as polls show broad disapproval of the war as the midterms approach. Said Aaron David Miller, a former State Department official, Trump launched a war of choice, overestimating America's military capacity and underestimating Iran's. That is a box that Trump cannot get out of right now. That box includes Iran's de facto closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which the U.S. counterblockade on Iranian ships has been unable to resolve. There is also Trump's demand for wide-ranging concessions by Iran on its nuclear program, which Tehran is resisting. Said Brad Bowman, a former U.S. Army officer and senior military expert at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, I worry that the president's going to codify a bad deal. Trump has let his frustration show. He complained on social media last week that critics were chirping that he should move faster or move slower or go to war or not go to war or whatever. He said they should sit back and relax because it will all work out well in the end. It always does. On Sunday, Trump insisted that he had not violated his campaign pledge to avoid endless wars, even though a conflict he called a little excursion in March has entered its fourth month. Look at Iraq. You were there for years, he said in an interview with Kristen Welker of NBC's Meet the Press. We're there for a few months, and the threat is largely over. Soon it will be over. But unlike Iraq, where U.S. ground forces toppled Saddam Hussein's government within weeks before eventually getting bogged down in a years-long insurgency, the Iran war has stood out for how quickly it has revealed the limits of what American firepower can accomplish. Mr. Bowman said that if the war left the Iranian leadership angry and still armed, with newfound influence over the Strait of Hormuz, then I'd say that's a negative outcome for the United States. The United States has demonstrated that it has the preeminent military in the world, but that the military power also has limitations. I do worry that this administration underestimated the Islamic Republic of Iran. Mr. Bowman said that a sharp escalation of the war by the U.S. would also be problematic and that the depletion of U.S. munition stocks had harmed America's military posture in Europe and Asia. But he acknowledged that his preferred route of heightening the economic and political pressure on Iran would be difficult to maintain for Trump, given Iran's ability to keep gasoline prices high with its grip on the strait. Deepening Trump's struggle to control the course of the war is his mercurial relationship with Netanyahu, who has angered the U.S. president with fierce strikes in Lebanon in his fight against Hezbollah, the Iran-aligned militant group there. Trump acknowledged last week that he had held a profanity-laced call with Netanyahu, explaining that I was a little bit perturbed at his constantly fighting with Lebanon. Mr. Miller, who specialized in the Middle East at the State Department, described Trump as largely successful in establishing leverage over Netanyahu. The perceived support of Trump is critical to Netanyahu's political survival in Israel, Mr. Miller said. Trump could well bring more pressure to bear on Netanyahu if it's necessary to secure an agreement with Iran, he predicted. But getting to that stage would require extracting more compromises from Iran. While Trump has shown he can change Israel's calculus, Miller said, he's not yet demonstrated that he can change Tehran's. That is his big problem. Here's another article. Pentagon again revises religious categories for troops. The Defense Department made the change after lawmakers objected to its original list, which did not include the Latter-day Saints among traditions labeled Christian. This is by John Ismay. In response to a request from Republican lawmakers, the Pentagon has again revised its list of religious categories that military service members can identify with in their personnel records. A Pentagon policy memo signed on May 20th and reported last week had excluded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, whose adherents are often referred to as Mormons, from being categorized as Christian. The move surfaced fears that the Defense Department was adopting a view held by some Protestant groups that members of the faith are heretical and should not be considered Christian. But on Monday, the Defense Department posted a revised list of religious categories on social media that eliminated a Christian prefix that had been applied to 21 other religious traditions, but not to Latter-day Saints, after lawmakers in Congress objected. Utah Republican Senators Mike Lee and John Curtis, who are members of the church, were among those who informed the White House and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth of their concerns that the new policy was unfairly exclusionary. Billy Gribben, a spokesman for Senator Lee, said that Senator Lee spoke with President Trump and Secretary Hegseth over the weekend and received their assurance that the Pentagon's religious classifications would be fixed. He appreciates the administration's action to address this issue. The public discussion about the categorization of the Latter-day Saints began on Thursday when Military.com published portions of a Pentagon memo signed on May 20th that said the Defense Department would no longer recognize 180 religious faith traditions in troops' service records. That left just 31 religious categories for uniformed personnel to choose, including the category of no religion. The move to shrink the number of recognized faiths was presented as an administrative action that a Pentagon spokesman said was long overdue. However, the number of faiths troops could select from expanded less than, that's not clear. I'll start again. However, the number of faiths troops could select from expanded less than a decade ago in March 2017 during the first Trump administration. That growth happened at the recommendation of the Armed Forces Chaplains Board, which provides advice and recommendations to senior civilian leaders in the Defense Department on policies and issues related to the free exercise of religion, as well as all matters concerning religion, spiritual readiness, morality, ethics, morale, and military chaplains. The longer list of more than 210 faiths, the 2017 policy memo said, was intended to standardize and better identify religious preferences recognized by military services and would enable better planning for religious support to uniformed personnel. It's a justification that is strikingly similar to the language used in the March 20th memo signed by the Pentagon's personnel chief, Anthony Tata, which said the consolidation of religious faith categories would provide chaplains with clear, readily available information that will better enable them to anticipate the religious support needs of service members. Latter-day Saints are among the most patriotic, service-oriented individuals in our country, Mr. Curtis said. They are also unequivocally Christian. Just look at who is in the name of the church, he added. And now on a different topic. What we know about weight loss drugs is rapidly changing. This is by Danny Bloom. Tens of millions of people around the world are now taking drugs like Ozempic, a kind of real-time experiment that offers far more data than a carefully controlled clinical trial can. Thanks to the rapid uptake of the drugs, we now have a clearer picture than ever of their effects and the challenges that come with taking them. Usually when a new medicine happens, we have time to learn how to use it, said Dr. Melanie Jay, director of the NYU Langone Comprehensive Program on Obesity. But with GLP-1 drugs, she said, everyone is kind of iterating in real time. Here's what we've learned in the process. They can treat much more than just diabetes or obesity. While these drugs were first approved to treat diabetes and then obesity, some of them have now been approved to reduce the risk of heart attacks and other cardiovascular issues and to treat sleep apnea, severe liver disease, and kidney disease. At least some of these benefits stem from weight loss itself, but researchers increasingly believe that drugs provide benefits that are completely separate from weight loss. A leading theory is that these drugs tamp down high levels of inflammation, which is tied to many chronic health issues. Scientists are also studying the potential for these drugs to treat a range of other conditions, including long COVID and substance use disorders. Emerging evidence has suggested that people on these drugs drink and smoke less and are less likely to develop substance use disorders, although scientists want more and larger trials before drawing conclusions. You regain weight if you stop taking them, but not necessarily all of it. In clinical trials of injectable drugs currently on the market, people lost around 15 to 20% of their body weight on average after about 72 weeks. Some real-world studies back up those numbers, but other research suggests people tend to lose less weight. The average weight loss in some real-world trials can range between about 8 and 17%, depending on the drug and the study. The discrepancy between these numbers and the data from clinical trials is at least partly because many people stop taking the drugs, sometimes because of side effects or costs. Many people who stop taking these drugs will regain at least some of the weight they've lost, but some people have been able to sustain weight loss. One analysis of records from over 180,000 patients found that over half of those who took semaglutide, the substance in Wegovy, or tirzepatide, the compound in Zepbound, kept at least some weight off or even lost additional weight 2 years after stopping. Hamlet Gasoyan, who studies these drugs at the Center for Value-Based Care Research at the Cleveland Clinic, said patients going off the drugs often turn to other methods to keep the weight off. Those can include intense exercise regimens, bariatric surgery, or other medications, whether those are older weight loss drugs or cheaper compounded versions of new ones. They don't work equally well for everyone. We now know that about 1 in 10 people on the drugs are what scientists call non-responders, who lose less than 5% of their body weight. And a small portion of people who take weight loss drugs are super responders, who lose a lot of weight in a short amount of time. Scientists think that genetics, as well as how much pleasure people naturally derive from eating, may play a role in these differing responses. They can have unexpected downsides. Ozempic breath, anyone? Many people on these medications experience side effects that have been reported in clinical trials: nausea, fatigue, and digestive issues like vomiting and diarrhea. But as more people have taken the drugs, all sorts of other less common concerns have cropped up. Some of these, like Ozempic breath, caused in part by dehydration from patients with dampened appetites drinking less, or Ozempic face, when losing fat leaves you looking hollowed out, have become topics of conversation on social media. Dr. Scott Hagen, an associate professor of medicine at the University of Washington, who studies obesity, has had patients complain that their hair is falling out. It's possible that this is a result of losing a large amount of weight quickly. People with anorexia also often lose some hair. Some of the issues that have emerged are more serious. A few studies have tied the use of these medications with a slightly increased risk of developing a very rare eye condition, though it isn't clear yet whether GLP-1s directly cause that condition. Doctors have also seen the drugs dial down appetite so extremely that some patients develop nutritional deficiencies, and the drugs have also been linked with a slight increase in risk for pancreatitis, though that remains extremely rare. Quick break. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Patients also frequently lose muscle mass on the medications. Many young, healthy patients have been able to recover muscle or preserve it in the first place by strength training and eating plenty of protein, doctors said. But they have seen older adults become more frail on these medications, making them more prone to falls. The right dose is up for debate. Patients taking these drugs start at the lowest dose and then typically titrate up over the course of months. Typically, the higher the dose, the more weight patients lose, and the lower their blood sugar drops. We're in this murky territory when there's lots of different doses to choose from. The highest one might put someone at a weight that may not be good for them long term, said Dr. Hagen. Keeping patients on too high a dose can suppress their appetite to unhealthy levels, leading to nutritional deficiencies and cause excessive weight loss that reduces bone density, leads to hormonal imbalances, and raises the risk of gallstones. They affect more than just your body. As the drugs have become more popular, more anecdotes have emerged about the subtle ways they affect people's personal lives and mental health. For example, many people say the drugs have changed their sex lives, in some cases by making them feel more desirable, and in other cases by dimming their libido. Some have said they feel more confident and are able to exercise and move around more easily. The idea that drugs might diminish pleasure or even joy in some patients has shown up in other ways too. Marie Spreckley, a researcher at the University of Cambridge studying these medications, said some patients have said they feel emotionally flatter without the delight they once found in food and less connected to the social element of eating. She said that those experiences warrant further research. Other people have said their personality felt duller on the medications or they felt more lethargic. It's been less than a decade since Ozempic hit the market. As more people take weight loss drugs and researchers continue to study them, we'll learn more about how these medications may change our health and the way we feel. Here's an interesting article, troubling. A question swirling around Putin's big conference. Could the war end? This is by Ivan Nechepurenko. It's a rather long article, so I might edit out some sections. Over the past month, President Vladimir Putin has said on two separate occasions that Russia's war against Ukraine is moving toward its conclusion and coming to an end. Speculation followed. Was Putin ready to end his invasion with Russian troops stalled on the front lines and the economy weighed down by war? Or did he plan to keep pressing toward his sweeping objective in Ukraine and believe victory to be at hand? As Putin's comments have left Russia's political and business elite anxiously guessing, it also got them talking at the Russian leader's flagship annual economic conference in St. Petersburg this week. Some discussed a possible endgame, as pro-Putin figures have appeared in state media in recent days, spinning Russia's current position in the war as a victory, potentially laying the groundwork for a way out if Putin chooses. Russia, they said on the sidelines of the forum, is at a crossroads more than 4 years into its invasion. If the war is prolonged and escalated, they said, it would require many more sacrifices from the elite and from society at large, potentially including more intense economic pain and an unpopular military mobilization that reaches deeper into the Russian population. Ukrainian officials have spoken in similar terms, saying that a primary goal of theirs is to force the Kremlin into a political decision either to negotiate or further mobilize, with a hope that it would choose negotiation. Such discussions inside Russia reflect a growing schism within the Russian political establishment between generally pro-Western technocrats who see much to gain from ending the war and conservative hawks who want the country to fight on. Aside from his two cryptic comments about a conclusion to the war, Putin has indicated that he is with the hawks. Speaking with heads of international news agencies on Thursday during the second day of the economic conference, Putin exuded confidence, saying Russian troops are advancing along the entire line of contact. That claim was at odds with reality. Last month, for the first time in more than 2 years, Russia was unable to achieve any meaningful advancement along the front. Some Russian pro-war bloggers called Putin's assessment fantastical and asked whether he really believed what he was saying. Putin also said it was up to Ukraine to abide by agreements he said he had made with Trump last summer during a summit in Alaska. Those are believed to include a Ukrainian withdrawal from the eastern Donbas region, an idea that Kyiv has rejected. On Friday, Putin said that an open letter from President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine offering a ceasefire and direct negotiations was not a serious bid for peace. Rather, he said, Mr. Zelensky's missive, which taunted Putin in personal terms, was creating an environment where it's impossible to hold any personal meetings at all. In all, Putin's remarks seem to indicate that the real difficulties facing Russia and the hopes among elites that the war could be wound down had so far left him unswayed. A leading Russian economist who runs a major government institution and requested anonymity to speak freely said the country faced difficult economic questions whether the war continued or not. To end it and the immense government spending that has come with it would cause a depression, he said. To continue it, he added, would require escalating the war effort, and that would mean resorting to aspects of Soviet-style state planning as the country has exhausted its ability to spend heavily on the war and maintain a semblance of normal life. The conflict in Ukraine defines the current and future state of Russia's economy, society, and politics. Yet, at the conference, it was the elephant in the room. Business leaders and government officials were mostly tight-lipped about the war, even on the sidelines. Mr. Zelensky is working to bring the British as well as the French and the Germans more into the negotiating process as the Americans lose interest, including with a meeting scheduled for Sunday in London. Mr. Dmitriev said he had been in touch with his American counterparts, including several phone calls with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. He said that Zelensky knew well what it would take to end the war. There's an understanding which Zelensky himself voiced that the U.S. said they would give security guarantees to Ukraine only if Ukraine leaves the Donbas, Mr. Dmitriev said. Other speakers at the conference, particularly those representing the more hawkish, ultra-nationalist factions of the Russian political class, said they saw no chance of an American brokered peace, offering instead a vision of perpetual war. Andrei Bezrukov, a former Russian spy who lived undercover in the West with his wife for decades, said that Russia should recognize that in the coming years, 2 decades perhaps, we will be at war. We must learn how to live with this war, said Mr. Bezrukov, who now serves as an advisor to the head of Russia's biggest oil company. We must build our state system and our economy so that it fulfills not only the goal of development, but the goal of defense too. And here's a good one. It just disappeared. Oh, here. This restaurant stopped charging for food and profit. Dylan Alverson stood amid tear gas and flashbang grenades on the frozen street where Alex Pretty was shot and killed by ICE agents in January, when he got the idea for what he later called an obscene. For the remainder of the government occupation, we will function as a free and donation-based restaurant, he wrote on social media 2 days after the shooting. The original intent of the change was to stop paying sales taxes to a government, he said, was actively inflicting daily harm on its citizens. The Pay What You Wish restaurant would also have a new name, Postmodern Times. Mr. Alverson's decision came in a moment of forceful, widely publicized local resistance to Operation Metro Surge, which brought 3,000 federal immigration agents, along with widespread unrest, to Minnesota last winter. More surprising, though, is what ensued in the weeks and months that followed. Postmodern Times thrived, even as the number of customers who don't pay for food now hovers between 40 and 50%. Said Mr. Alverson, I have succeeded more than I ever did when I was running a conventional business employing 22 people. I think that's proof that something is wrong. On one of the first warm days of spring last month, the breakfast rush began as soon as the doors opened at Postmodern Times at 9 a.m. Mr. Alverson, a married, nose-ringed father of three, paused between tasks as diners took their seats. Among them was Antonio Malone, a video artist who said he's eaten at the restaurant every day for 3 weeks, drawn by the quality free food. Sophia Padilla is a neighborhood regular whose son loves the pancakes. She doesn't believe the city is fully healed from the turmoil of the winter. The whole neighborhood felt like a war zone, she said. I want to support a business that cares so much about the community. Mr. Alverson is both host of and spokesman for his diner-style restaurant, built inside the former offices of an alternative newspaper and literary center. He has articulated his evolving vision to numerous inquirers, including journalists, documentary filmmakers, and members of an experimental theater troupe. What started as a workaround to paying sales tax has evolved into a business that verges on performance art. While Modern Times' proximity to tragic events is just 4 blocks from where Renee Good was killed and 6 blocks from the site of George Floyd's murder, has contributed to its challenges, the financial precarity Mr. Alverson has experienced in the past 6 years isn't uncommon. His restaurant generated $1.3 million in sales last year and still lost $18,500, according to a financial statement prepared by an accountant. And that's in spite of cost-conscious measures like paying himself just $23,000 a year as the restaurant's manager, chef, and fix-it man. I've been wearing as many hats as possible, he said. The numbers don't work. Modern Times' distinctive merchandise has added a revenue stream since the restaurant introduced limited-run, artist-designed T-shirts during the pandemic. Attention brought on by Operation Metro Surge and Mr. Alverson's response to it triggered an uptick in those sales from $60,000 a year to $25,000 in April of this year alone, along with a flood of financial gifts from outside Minnesota. Mr. Alverson describes his current operation as a creation period. The goal is to find a blueprint that works for him and others. What I realized was happening right away is that we created a place of economic equality that doesn't really exist in a business setting, he said. What can we learn from this? His efforts have not been universally embraced. Mr. Alverson said neighbors regularly complain that Postmodern Times is attracting diners who raise the potential for crime. Derek Armstrong is one answer to those concerns. He provides security outside the restaurant most days, drawing on his experience working as a violence interrupter at George Floyd Square, intervening peacefully before crimes could occur. He knows how to navigate intense moments that can be complicated by drug addiction and mental illness, as he suspected was the case the time a customer turned a butter knife on an employee. But his volunteer work is usually much easier than that, he said, and he often knows the people involved. I can sometimes call names and be like, calm down, Mr. Armstrong explained. Etiquette things to make sure is being run like the high-end quality restaurant it is. Connie Olson, who started as a dishwasher last year, recently began shifts doing work similar to Mr. Armstrong's. It's difficult, he said, but also worth it, and not just because it pays $25 an hour rather than the $18 he made as a dishwasher. It's important for me that everyone has the same restaurant experience, regardless of our level of impoverishment or disability or class, he said. Mallory Alekna, a music director at nearby Augsburg University, is a regular paying customer who said she appreciates the diversity of the restaurant's dining rooms. These are not people that we need to be afraid of, she said. They're our neighbors. Fernando Amador, an immigrant from Colombia, said he barely left his home for 2 months during Operation Metro Surge for fear he would be targeted by immigration agents because of his accent and skin color, even though he's in the country legally. Mr. Amador, a Postmodern Times line cook, searched for the words in English to express his gratitude for the support, financial and otherwise, that Mr. Alverson provided him and his family. How you say bootlicker, he asked. Mr. Amador wanted to emphasize that he wasn't just kissing up to his boss when he compared him to an angel. For his part, Mr. Alverson said one of his big goals last winter was simply not coming out of it with any shame. The spirit of the experiment came to him when he realized what could happen when neighbors decided to leave their home to help people without fear, he explained. What we saw underneath all of the horror was something that looked more like the future that I want to be part of. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And here's an editorial by Frank Bruni called Tilling Honor in a Political Landscape Barren of It. With J.D. Vance as vice president and Pete Hegseth as defense secretary, now probably isn't the best time to argue for more veterans in public service. But Ry Barkott wants to make the case anyway. It's a persuasive one. He points out that as a general rule, Americans who've served in the military have forged bonds with and learned to respect people from diverse backgrounds in different places. The uniform can unite those who wear it as much as anything else divides them. Broadly speaking, they have had certain positive values such as discipline and teamwork drilled into them. There's also a degree of humility that military service instills. Barkott, a 47-year-old former Marine, told me during a 2-hour conversation in North Carolina. You have served something that is larger than yourself, and you've done that, he added, at potential risk, having accepted the idea that the public good may demand personal sacrifice. Imagine America if more politicians genuinely endorsed and acted on that principle. Barkott has written a thoughtful, hopeful book called Courage Can Save Us, U.S. capitalized, 10 Extraordinary Americans and the Fight for Our Future, that's being published this week. It profiles current office holders, half Democrats, half Republicans, and suggests that qualities honed in the military, or in one congressman's case, the FBI, position them to be less partisan, more independent, more civic-minded leaders. The book also reflects Barkott's passion project. He's the chief executive officer and one of the founders of With Honor, a nonpartisan group that since 2018 has encouraged more men and women who've worn the uniform or performed similar government service, such as defense, law enforcement, or intelligence work, to run for political office. To date, With Honor has supported more than 250 such candidates with more than $100 million across federal, state, and local races. Those candidates must first sign a pledge to conduct themselves with civility, integrity, and the courage to work across party lines. I was curious about Barkott's perspective because we need more politicians with less vanity, less stridency, less pettiness. We need valor in a political landscape often barren of it. If recruiting a greater number of veterans improves the odds of getting that, I'm for it. It might. I don't think there's any definitive proof, but there's this. On Wednesday, 4 House Republicans mustered the moxie to break party ranks and vote to direct President Trump to get congressional approval for the sustained engagement of American combat troops with Iran. 2 of those Republicans, Tom Barrett of Michigan and Warren Davidson of Ohio, each served in the military for more than a decade. A third, Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, is the former FBI agent in Barkott's book. His work for the Bureau included counterterrorism operations abroad. The fourth dissident was Thomas Massie of Kentucky. Barkott's 9 profile subjects, in addition to Fitzpatrick, are the Democratic governors Mikey Sherrill of New Jersey and Wes Moore of Maryland, the Republican House members John James of Michigan, Don Bacon of Nebraska, and Dan Crenshaw of Texas, the Democratic House members Seth Moulton of Massachusetts and Jared Golden of Maine, Senator Mark Kelly, Democrat of Arizona, and Senator Todd Young, Republican of Indiana. There are flaws, failures, and disappointments aplenty among those politicians. But there's also evidence of conscience and of openness to contrary views. In aggregate, they're a more impressive bunch than any random selection of 10 elected officials. Although Crenshaw, a former Navy SEAL, has voted in line with President Trump since his return to the White House in January 2025, he publicly condemned him in early 2021 for his incendiary and bogus claims about a stolen election, and he's known for his willingness to tangle with fellow Republicans. This year, Trump refused to endorse Crenshaw's re-election bid, and Crenshaw lost his primary 3 months ago to a far-right challenger. Bacon, a former Air Force brigadier general who represents a district that voted for Joe Biden in 2020 and Kamala Harris in 2024, has a bolder reputation than Crenshaw's for statements that challenge other Republicans, including Trump. He's taken a stance on stuff like the renaming of the Gulf of Mexico, Barkat said. He was the only Republican to vote against that. He basically said it was a silly idea. The exact word Bacon used was juvenile. Candor like that has earned him harassment and threats. At one point, Bacon's wife slept with a loaded gun within reach. He announced last year that he would leave the House at the end of this term, his fifth. On the Democratic side, Moulton, a former Marine, sometimes quarreled with the Biden administration and has pointedly questioned Democratic orthodoxy. Kelly, a retired astronaut and naval officer, has also broken with his party at times, but more notably drew threats from Hegseth of a court-martial, a demotion in rank, and a reduction in retirement pay for participating in a 2025 video that reminded troops that they had not only the right, but also the duty to disobey illegal orders. Not all veterans who run for office are interested in flexing political independence or in taking with honors pledge, much as the impulse to join the military is, for some people, less altruistic than self-aggrandizing, less philosophical than practical, less patriotic than jingoistic. Veterans aren't axiomatically virtuous and valorous, and some have a take on military culture that's exclusionary, discriminatory, or censorious. Hegseth, a bellicose theocrat, has gone out of his way to marginalize black and female officers. The prevalence of veterans in Congress has declined significantly over the past half century, during which Americans' respect for Congress has also plummeted. In the mid-1970s, about 75% of senators and House members had served in the military. Now it's just under 20%. From George Washington through George H.W. Bush, the overwhelming majority of our presidents were veterans. But since then, it's the opposite. Some potential contenders for the presidency in 2028 are veterans. But since then, it's the opposite. On the Republican side, there's Vance, Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, and if the stench of his 2024 humiliation fades sufficiently, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. Among Democrats, there's Kelly, Moore, former Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, Senator Ruben Gallego of Arizona, and if you count CIA and Defense Department work, Senator Elisa Slotkin of Michigan. I realize there's only one woman on that list, just as there's only one woman on Barkat's book. And that's another reason not to give too many political bonus points to veterans who run for office. Given the composition of our military, veterans are more likely to be male than female, and I don't think we'd benefit at all from fewer women in Congress and state houses. But I'm inspired by many of the veterans in politics with whom I've interacted. I think Senator Tammy Duckworth, Democrat of Illinois, whom I once pitched as Biden's ideal 2020 running mate. I think of Bob Kerrey, who was the governor of Nebraska and later represented the state in the Senate. They, like many other veterans, tempered individual ambition with a sense of common mission. I spotted the military's fingerprints in that, and I liked what I saw. Here's an essay by Peter Beinart called "Who Will Account for Another Foreign Policy Failure?" Donald Trump is conducting a real-world test of what happens when hawks in Washington get what they've been urging for decades, all-out war with Iran. The early results are stark. This war is on track to cost the U.S. more than $1 trillion. It has resulted in enormous damage to American military bases in the Middle East, significantly reduced the stockpile of interceptor missiles on which the United States relies to deter China and other potential adversaries, put tens of millions of people around the world at risk of acute hunger, accelerated inflation in the U.S., and led to the death or injury of hundreds of Americans and thousands of Iranians, including more than 100 children, who were reported killed when a Tomahawk missile mistakenly hit an elementary school in the town of Minab. Despite this economic and human toll, the war has achieved very little. While the president has been typically erratic in outlining the war's aims over the past 3 months, he has generally stressed three objectives: eliminating Iran's ballistic missiles, ending its nuclear program, and helping the Iranian people overthrow their government. None of that has happened. According to America's own intelligence, the Islamic Republic retains roughly 70% of its pre-war missile stockpile. The U.S. has neither eliminated Iran's access to the highly enriched uranium that could be potentially used to build a nuclear bomb, nor taken down the Islamic regime itself. Indeed, the Iranian government is arguably stronger than it was when the war began, having demonstrated its ability to cripple the global economy by restricting traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. How or when this war will end is uncertain. But one thing is clear, such foreign policy catastrophes will keep occurring unless the people who champion them are held to account. Had such a reckoning occurred after America's invasion of Iraq, it is much less likely the United States would be at war with Iran today. By George W. Bush's second term, most Americans believed the Iraq invasion had been a mistake, and they expressed their discontent for years after that by repeatedly voting for presidential candidates who would oppose the war, like Barack Obama, or at least pretended to have opposed it, like Donald Trump, rather than candidates who supported the invasion, like Hillary Clinton and John McCain. Yet, when it came to appointed office, officials who had supported the war were rewarded. Mr. Obama chose a running mate, Joe Biden, and two secretaries of state, Ms. Clinton and John Kerry, who had voted to authorize the Iraq war. In his first term, Trump chose a national security advisor, John Bolton, who had supported the invasion. When Mr. Biden became president, he selected as his Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, who was his top foreign policy staff member when he cast his disastrous vote for war. This lack of accountability extends beyond the executive branch. A couple of years ago, the Quincy Institute, an anti-interventionist think tank, tallied which experts most often testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee between 2021 and 2024, under both Democrats and Republicans. The second most frequently invited think tank was the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which declared on its website on the eve of the Iraq War that we know Saddam Hussein is making weapons of mass destruction, biological, chemical, and nuclear, and remains a serious threat. Tied for the third most invited was the American Enterprise Institute, which boasted before the Iraq invasion that it had taken a leading role in defining the threat that Saddam poses and outlining how Iraq should be reconstructed once he is removed. Officials from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and the American Enterprise Institute are once again among the loudest champions of war today. This is not to say that every policymaker or pundit who supported a failed war should be banished from public debate, but at the very least, we should expect analysts and public officials whose judgment proves faulty to go beyond merely regretting their errors and show that they have rethought the assumptions that underlay them. I supported the Iraq War myself and wrote a book grappling with why I had been so profoundly wrong. That doesn't undo the harm my commentary did, but only by more clearly challenging the mindset that underpinned the Iraq and Iran wars will the American foreign policy class shed its addiction to military force and recognize that the U.S. should primarily prioritize diplomatic solutions with its adversaries rather than trying to bludgeon them into submission. And yet, rather than being asked to reckon with their past errors, advocates of war are routinely offered a clean slate to promote war yet again. On March 1st, the day after the U.S. attacked Iran, Lindsey Graham, one of the Senate's most voluble hawks, said on Meet the Press that the largest state sponsor of terrorism, Iran, is close to collapsing, and declared that we destroyed their missile program, the nuclear program. When, 2.5 months later, after neither proved to be true, he appeared on the same program, he was not asked to answer for those comments and predicted that if we go back to military activity, weaken them further, then we can end this thing pretty soon. 20 years ago, when U.S. troops were dying in Baghdad and Ramadi, it was hard to imagine this country launching another unprovoked war to oust the government in the Middle East. Yet another such war has now occurred, in part because Iraq transformed American public opinion far more than it transformed the foreign policy debate in Washington. The recent House vote to try to halt the Iran war by invoking the War Powers Act is a sign that more politicians are finally heeding the country's anti-war mood. But it's a small first step. Without a deeper reckoning, we should expect future self-inflicted cataclysms to further undermine not only America's power around the world, but the public's faith in our democracy at home. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Okay, for some reason that stopped, so I'm going to start over. They walk among us. The glowing green letters emerge ominously against a dark backdrop. Above them hover the words aliens and declassified, suggesting the release, long awaited in some corners of the internet, of secret government files concerning extraterrestrials. Slowly, tantalizingly, more text appears. For 60 years, the U.S. government has kept a closely guarded secret. Then the big reveal. It's not a trailer for a horror film. It's a White House webpage posted last Thursday, and the scary creatures in question aren't extraterrestrials. They're the other kind of aliens, the immigrant kind, the kind hunted by ICE. Quote, aliens have been walking among us, living in our neighborhoods and interacting with us in our daily lives. They've shopped in the same stores, attended the same classes as our children, and lived seemingly normal human existences. That's the joke. Human beings are described as non-human invaders. Fascism, but make it a troll. This webpage, which invites users to look up the number of immigrants supposedly arrested on charges of criminal activity in American cities and towns, belongs to a subgenre of Trumpian gestures that are menacing and sophomoric at the same time. Grotesque and terrifying and juvenile is how Ernesto Verdeja, a genocide prevention expert at the University of Notre Dame, described it to me. These gestures are hard to write about. The ugliness is undisguised, so what is there to say? And yet, these statements, step by preposterous step, change the world we live in. With phrases like, they do not belong here, and deport them all, the page struck me as an incitement for Americans to commit acts of violence against immigrants. But Benjamin Valentino, a professor of government at Dartmouth, thinks that the purpose of the page is not to get Americans to do anything. It's to get them to do nothing, while the government commits its campaign of cruelty against millions of people just trying to live in peace. They want a majority of the population to turn their backs, he said. That's all that's necessary. Valentino co-founded the Early Warning Project, which assesses the risk of mass atrocities around the world. To be sure, anti-immigrant violence in the U.S. doesn't approach the scale of the atrocities Valentino usually studies, but the dehumanizing language of the sort used by the Trump administration is, he said, a pretty standard indicator of risk, a necessary if insufficient condition of mass violence directed at a particular group. It's not that it turns normal people into murderers, he said. It's that it turns them into bystanders. To the extent that the Trump administration has pulled back on its violent anti-immigrant campaign, it has done so because non-immigrants have stepped up in the courts and especially in the streets. The most dramatic confrontation took place this past winter in Minneapolis, but in the months since the federal government ended its occupation of that city, resistance has continued. In Newark, New Jersey, demonstrators have been protesting the conditions at the Delaney Hall ICE detention facility. At least 63 people have been arrested in the past week alone. In New York City, a relatively new coalition called Hands Off New York City has, since January, trained more than 7,000 volunteers to peacefully resist ICE. The Aliens webpage, Valentino thinks, is intended to discourage that kind of activity. The key is that you're supposed to see your city with the big red dot over it, he said, referring to a map on the website. Then click to read supposedly the number of immigrants who have been charged with crimes. For example, Jamestown, New York, 10. Larceny, obstructing the police. Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico, Nigeria. And you see the charges. Do you want to risk your life for this kind of person? When the page went up, the American Immigration Council, a pro-immigration advocacy organization, happened to be hosting a gathering of data experts. Participants thought they saw something interesting. The page is poorly coded, badly designed, and yet weirdly transparent about some things the administration hasn't been transparent about before, said Aaron Reichlin Melnick, a senior fellow at the council. It appeared that the map was based on raw data of ICE arrests, information that the government had mostly kept secret since the beginning of Trump's second term. The map is possibly the best document to date of the scale of the ICE campaign, which, it shows, has raged not only in big cities but in small towns, where it's sometimes less visible. As is usual for the Trump administration, the figures are decontextualized and misrepresented. In addition to the map, the page contains a supposed tally of encounters, a term that has one meaning in 1970s sci-fi and another in Customs and Border Protection speak, where it typically refers to instances in which immigrants are apprehended. What struck me after spending too much time staring at the page was that it wants you to be afraid of all aliens, the space kind and the illegal kind, but also the legal kind, foreign-born people who have been living in this country for decades. As for the counter, it's tracking nothing. The numbers just tick upward at a perfectly steady pace, one every second or so. Underscoring the sophomoric aspect of this astonishing document is the fact that it's shot through with references to the X-Files. I caught only one of them. The last line says, "The truth is no longer out there. It's right here, right now," a nod to the show's tagline. Verdeja, the Notre Dame professor, grew up with the show, so he pointed out some other echoes, such as the combination of interplanetary warfare and a deep state conspiracy. But superimposed on all that pop culture are the white supremacist tropes. The sentences about aliens walking among us, living in our neighborhoods, Verdeja said, read to him like invocations of the Great Replacement theory, which has become so familiar as to seem almost mainstream. He said it's similar to the way Jews were talked about in Europe in the 1920s and 30s. He made the comparison gingerly, wary of falling into an alarmist cliche. But the ideologues of Trump's immigration policies are taking no such pains. A couple of days after the aliens page was published, Greg Bovino, the former head of the U.S. Border Patrol who oversaw the federal immigration operation in Minneapolis, traveled to Portugal for a meeting of far-right politicians to discuss what they call remigration, a concept that refers to the forcible displacement of millions of people on the basis of their ethnicity in the wake of World War I, what we now call ethnic cleansing. Driven by the same nativist and xenophobic ideas, the United States adopted the Immigration Acts of 1921 and 24, which ended mass immigration by introducing national origin quotas designed to favor Northern and Western Europeans and exclude non-white immigrants almost entirely. These quotas stayed in place for 4 decades until they were repealed just over 60 years ago, which is when the White House page claims the story of the aliens began. The point of making historical connections is not to say that any two actions or any two eras are exactly alike. Context always changes. But it's important to see that this webpage isn't just a troll. It didn't come out of nowhere. Provocations like this are part of an old and terrible story, and it's still being written today. And we'll use the last couple minutes for some letters to the editor. This one is from Pennsylvania. The temper and infantile nature of Trump were on display for all with open eyes to see in his recent abbreviated interview with Kristen Welker on Meet the Press. Ms. Welker dared to ask fair questions and to push back when the president engaged in his usual behavior of obfuscating, making charges without evidence, and lying. Any member of the news media who asks Trump questions that he does not want to answer is angrily disparaged with a variety of epithets. This time, the questioner's credibility was challenged and she was branded crooked or stupid and a member of the fake dirty press. Predictably, Trump walked out of the interview unwilling to take any more heat. I applaud Ms. Welker for attempting the impossible, getting honest answers from a president who is accustomed to being coddled by individuals who will never challenge him or tell him anything he doesn't want to hear. The leader of the free world is a coward. And here's another from Virginia. Do you know why Kristen Welker didn't back down from Trump's anger on Meet the Press? Because she's not concerned with his anger. What we witnessed in that interview was a 1950s male entitlement and power getting pushback from a woman of 2026. Trump was stumped because his anger is always mollified, not ignored, and he saw no alternative but to stomp out. We have been raising our daughters to know they are the equal of any of our sons. Ms. Welker is proof that we are doing it right. And you've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, June 8th New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This is Ted. I hope you've enjoyed this. I found these articles interesting. I certainly hope you did. And I look forward to talking to you next week. Be well. Bye.